second section, and I am going to hand you over to none other than Michaela Waters. She is a final year business and accounting student at Maynooth University. She's an NStEP student trainer, student quality assurance reviewer, a student member of the National Forum, or the NStEP National Advisory Group for Student Engagement, and she's National Forum Student Associate in Maynooth University. So highly interested in student representation and empowering students, Michaela has supported academic representatives in her voluntary role as social sciences faculty convener, amongst many other roles. And since 2020, she's been a student associate intern for the Irish Universities Association, enhancing digital teaching and learning project at Maynooth University, focusing on improving the digital skills of students, lecturers and staff. And that team have created beautiful resources and delivered presentations on topics such as student engagement, staff-student partnership, digital skills, academic integrity, and what lecturers can do to support students. So a huge body of work there. So I'm delighted to hand you over to Michaela.
Hi everyone, it's brilliant to see so many engaged people attending to hear from the brilliant Dr. Roisín Curran and also Rhiannon Cavanagh. So this session is all about fostering student partnership within institutions and at the national level. So what works and what more can we do? So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Roisín Curran, who is the interim head of the Centre for Higher Education Research and Practice in Ulster University. So Dr. Roisín Curran started her teaching career in further education in 1997, having previously worked in the financial services industry in London for 9 years. Since 2004, she's worked as the staff and educational developer at Ulster University, and she is currently the interim head of the Centre for Higher Education Research and Practice. She's also the course director of the Master in Education course, a professional development programme for staff. So Roisín has also led a cross-disciplinary project team at Ulster as part of a national What Works student retention and student success change programme involving 13 institutions across the UK. So this action research has further extended sector knowledge of what works in relation to improving student engagement, retention, and most importantly, success. Roisín has a particular interest in student engagement and has also published papers on the impact of a students as partners approach on staff student engagement. She has also co-developed a new integrated curriculum design framework at Ulster that scaffolds the student journey and that which promotes a relational-based partnership approach, active learning, peer support, and ways of thinking and practicing the discipline. So I'm absolutely delighted to hand you over to Roisín for her what I'm sure will be a brilliant presentation. So thank you, Roisín.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Can everybody see the slides and hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, and that is student engagement and the role that staff-student partnership has to play in actually promoting student engagement. I was also delighted to see the new strategy that's been put forward this morning, and absolutely agree with the key strategic vision and mission within that, and it's about strengthening student engagement. So that was really, really nice to see. And the research that you mentioned there as part of my introduction, I will be referring to some of that today, and I'll be following up with links and so on. Okay, I'm going to start by asking the question, what do we mean by student engagement? Because in my experience, we talk a lot about student engagement and we use terms like student voice or student partnership. And sometimes these terms can be used interchangeably, and it can lead to inconsistency, confusion, and misunderstanding. So I think when we're having conversations, whether it be at a local level, faculty level, school level, institutional level, we really need to be sure that we're all talking about the same thing, because sometimes we're talking about student attendance and we're calling it student engagement. And I think we just need to be really, really careful. So I would suggest, and I'd like to take a wee bit of a deeper dive today into looking at what do we actually mean by student engagement. And I think it's really important to conceptualize what it is, what it isn't, so that we're very, very clear. And I think also in the strategy document, what was really, really helpful, and I was delighted to see it on page 10 of the document, there's a definition there of what is student engagement, what is student voice, and what is student partnership. And I think it's important that we do refer to that as we go forward. I skipped one there, sorry. So what does the literature say? Back in 2012-13, I was embarking on that What Works project, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then I based my own doctoral research around students as partners in student engagement. And when I embarked on quite a large literature review on what do we mean by student engagement, there isn't really an agreed definition of what it is or what it excludes. And it really came down to the fact that it can be shaped very much by our personal values, by our personal beliefs, but also by our geographical context, by our disciplinary interests, and also by socioeconomic conditions. And the difficulty that this presents, as Graham Gibbs quite eloquently put it, is that the term student engagement has come to be used to refer to so many different things that it's difficult to keep track of what people are actually talking about. And I think that's just an important reminder for us. But the good news is that within the literature, there is a consensus. And the consensus would suggest that student engagement is best understood as existing on a continuum in a number of domains. And those domains are cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. And particularly since the pandemic, when all in-person learning was suspended, the emotional aspect of student engagement has been brought to the fore, not just from a student perspective, but also from a staff perspective. And we'll explore that in a little bit more detail. The research also suggests that student engagement is multifaceted, but the increasing relevance of student engagement is really important in that achievement of not just individual goals, but also institutional and societal goals as well. The literature also tells us that central to that notion of student engagement is the individual student, and each comes with their unique characteristics and attributes. And we know that now even more when we look at an inclusive curriculum design. And it also suggests that active rather than being a passive participant in learning is extremely important. And we know that learning is an emotional experience, but that active notion of being active in the process is really important. And that active process then is facilitated and sustained through reciprocal relationships. And those relationships are with other students and staff. I'm sure some of you are familiar with McHealy, Flint and Harrington's model of students as partners in learning and teaching in higher education. And in their model or their definition, they suggest that partnership is fundamentally about a relationship. And that relationship involves students, academics, professional services staff, senior managers, student union, and so on. And it suggests that they should be actively engaged in and stand to gain from the process of learning and working together. So therefore, and again, you have this in your strategy document this morning, partnership is essentially a process of engagement, not necessarily a product. And it's a way of doing things rather than an outcome in itself. And if we look at Healy, Flint and Harrington's overview model for students as partners, you'll see there that they've got the four areas or the four domains, if you like, where partnership learning communities can happen. And I thought that tied in very nicely with the four domains noted in your strategy document this morning. And it's got learning, teaching and assessment, curriculum design and pedagogic consultancy, student-based research and inquiry, and then scholarship of teaching and learning. And I would suggest that staff-student partnership is probably best to start in the learning, teaching, assessment space, where students are actually experiencing the learning when they first come to university. And then they can build the capacity and the confidence to engage in those other domains, if you like, in terms of that true partnership. Just staying with active learning then for a moment, because of its importance. Again, the literature tells us that effective student engagement does promote that deep learning. And that's what we want at university. We don't want rote learning and surface learning. We want our students to truly come away with that good understanding of what to do with knowledge, not just the acquisition of knowledge. So it focuses on what the student does, and it engages students in active learning. So learning, therefore, is a joint activity, and it starts from the student's experience. So we know that adult learners start from what they already know and what they've already experienced, and then how they can build on that. And it should be about changing the learner's perspective on knowledge. So learning, therefore, in higher education is less about the absorption of knowledge and more about how we as educators and others who work in higher education, how do we set the right conditions for that conceptual change to take place? And that should include things like student motivation and students working collaboratively with others, and that's both peers and teachers. Something else I wanted to explore today, and I'll refer to on the next slide, a piece of literature around this, and it's something about pathways to learning. So we know from a few slides earlier that when we talked about student engagement is best understood as existing as a variable across the cognitive, the emotional, and the behavioral domains. But should an emotional domain be the starting point? What about our first years that come to university? How are they feeling when they come in? You know, they may be full of trepidation, they may not know anyone. So as learning occurs, when students experience that trust and feel motivated, then their confidence to develop and grow. And I always think about Barnett and Coates' 3 dimensions of curriculum. And it's something when you talked earlier in your introduction, I've co-designed a curriculum design framework at Ulster, and we talk about knowing, doing, and being. And we say to our colleagues when they're designing curriculum, think about what does the student need to know? What does the student need to be able to do? And what does the student need to be and become? And I think those 3 things are equally important when we design curriculum, not just the knowledge or the knowledge and the skills, but that notion of being and becoming as well. So again, a question I think that we need to ask ourselves is, how do we create those effective learning climates that promote independent lifelong learners? Because we know that we have a certain amount of control around those learning climates. And that's not just the physical spaces on our campuses. That could be the social spaces. That could be where a student goes to pay their fees. It could be where they go to have a conversation about someone about finance. And obviously the online spaces. And never more has that been so relevant as in the last 2 years. So how do we create that climate that's trusting and translate into action at all levels of the student-teacher interaction? And Ella Cahu has done a lot of work in this space, and I particularly like a model that she's put forward. But more recently, Cahu, Picton, and Nelson illustrate how student and university factors interact to influence engagement as conceptualized in their framework. And I just want to let that diagram land with you for a moment, because for me, looking at all the models and definitions of student engagement, for me, this is the one that captures it in a way that I feel I can conceptualize where student engagement is, what does it look like, and where can we enhance it. If you look at the first 2 columns, they talk about structural influences of the university and the student. And there was a comment earlier, I think, by Lee talking about culture. All of our universities have a certain culture, you know, and that culture is the way we do things. It's how people interact in buildings. It's that day-to-day, the way that we work. It's the way our disciplines are set up. It's the way the curriculum is. And students are coming into that cold, if you like. And how do we embrace them into that culture, or hopefully that community of learning? The students themselves, we know they're individual. They have their own attributes and characteristics. They have their background. They have their family, their support, their previous experiences. And that notion of life load is really important, because that's the other things that are going on in their life, their part-time jobs, their caring responsibilities, and so on and so forth. Could be their daily commute to university, or where they're living and who they're living with, and so on. And then the psychosocial influences on the second column talks about, you know, the university's teaching, the workload, the students, how that curriculum is experienced. And for the student then, it's the motivation, the skills, their identity. And that identity is changing all the time, and their personality. But in between the two of those, you've got the word relationships. And to me, that's where staff-student partnerships is critical. And you can see then the double-sided arrow going into the educational interface. So if we get the relationships right, we're impacting on that educational interface. And by the engagement in the educational interface, we're impacting back into the partnerships. So for me, this diagram just captured it beautifully, where partnerships and engagement, you know, meet, if you like. Now, we mentioned the three domains, student engagement, the three domains of emotional, cognitive, and behavioral, and you can see those listed there in the educational interface. And then Cahu and Nelson talk about these pathways, and they list them as self-efficacy, emotions, belonging, and well-being. Now, these are new additions to this framework just in the last couple of years. And these are the pathways to student engagement. And you'll see there that emotions has got a singular pathway by itself. And that's how important emotions is in the whole learning process. That notion of belonging that we've been talking about for many years in the sector, and belonging was central to the What Works research that I was involved in. And also well-being now is certainly at the fore, not just for students, but for staff, about how our well-being is and the impact that directly has on the learning experience. So I'll come back to that diagram in a little bit, and I'll come back to the sort of the latter two columns towards the end. So that research that I've just referenced there really proposes those four pathways to engagement. As I said, the self-efficacy, emotions, belonging, and well-being. And their recent research set out to gain that in-depth understanding of the complexities of student experience and engagement within that educational interface through the use of student narratives. So I would really encourage you to go actually and read that paper. But I'll just summarize their conclusions and recommendations were that each student journey is unique. Student engagement is a responsibility of both students and institutions. We do need to develop student agencies, and we need to inform students of the realities of university life. And also, and it seems so basic, but the diverse benefits of friendships and relationships with staff and participating in class to foster well-being need to be, we need to keep reminding ourselves of the importance of these things. And also institutions can make structural changes to promote engagement through those four pathways that we've seen on the diagram. So going back to the title of my talk today is about the power and potential of staff-student partnerships to influence and promote engagement. Whilst students have responsibilities for engagement, we as staff can facilitate that. And I always go back to Curran and Gampson because in there, I think they had 7 principles around student engagement. And in their first principle, they said, staff concern helps students get through rough times and keep on working. And they say that knowing a few staff members well enhances students' intellectual commitment and encourages them to think about their own values and future plans. So when times get tough, and they will do, knowing staff and being able to approach staff is extremely important. I'll just refer briefly to the What Works model of student retention and success. And there's a whole body of evidence. There was a What Works 1. Liz Thomas was involved, led this indeed, 2012. And then there was the What Works 2 between 2013 and 2017. But their What Works model of student retention and success suggested that within the student experience, there were those 3 spheres: the academic sphere, the social sphere, and the services sphere. And the academic sphere is that timetabled, the class timetables, the lectures, and so on. And then you've got the social and the services. And they suggest it's where those 3 intersect is where the students experience belonging. But you'll notice that the academic sphere is the largest. because that's what has the most impact on the student experience, particularly for students that commute, who rush off campus for part-time jobs and so on. They may not get the same opportunity to engage in the social scene or engage in, the student union activities and so on. So what we do in the academic sphere is extremely important in promoting that sense of belonging and that emotional engagement with the learning. And then they talk about staff capacity building. Again, that's mentioned in your strategy today, and the student capacity building for engagement. And this is something maybe you can look at afterwards. So that early engagement to promote belonging is extremely important in the student life cycle. The academic sphere that I mentioned is critical, and that developing the capacity of staff and students to engage is absolutely that, so that students can experience belonging, will stay on the courses and be successful. I just thought I would give some sort of takeaways for today, and this is an abridged version of some guidance that I had written up for colleagues at Ulster. And I was trying to, I suppose, summarize these in terms of that emotional, behavioral and cognitive, and then the last one around self-efficacy. And it was really guidance aimed at staff and students. And these are easy things that we can all do on a day-to-day basis. But how do we create that welcoming environment that students can come into HE, can make friends, find their way around and get ready to learn in a new way? Because we know that students come to us from Leaving Cert or A-level are not higher education learners. And there is that transition into higher education. And for students, it's about being open and flexible and to remember that everyone is feeling the same at the start. We know that levels of confidence are low, but get involved, participate in the activities offered. Back to the active learning then, how do we make our timetabled sessions interactive so that relationships are developed in the academic sphere and learning is collaborative, interesting and worthwhile? When we reach out to students that drop out of our courses, quite often the reason students drop out is that they just felt they never fitted in or that they weren't able to make friends and they had a very lonely experience. And it seems such a shame when students work really hard at second level, to get the grades, to get the points, to get into university. And then by first semester, they've dropped out. So how can we help those relationships to be developed? Again, for students, it may be just about attending in the first instance, but how do you then participate and hopefully get involved in the activities to get to know other staff and students? Also, from the What Works research that we did, we found that when students select courses at university, it's because they're really interested in that discipline area. And the earlier we can get students involved in the discipline, and that could be things like, lab-based work, it could be field trips, it could be engagement with employers, and doing and experiencing the discipline, that really helped in making motivations and connections to students in their learning and tied in with their career aspirations. So again, it's about opportunities for practicing the discipline. And finally, around self-efficacy, how do we help students develop that self-efficacy to be successful? And that I think a critical point there is about authentic assessment and feedback that helps students test their application of knowledge. When we ask first-year students, when did you first experience that sense of belonging at university? They said, when I got my first piece of feedback, because up until that point, I felt like everyone else in the class was smarter than me. And some of them were experiencing that imposter syndrome that they shouldn't be there. So feedback and those low stakes assessment early on is absolutely critical to build in that sense of belonging. And for students, it's not about seeing assessment as just hoops to jump through. It's really trying to see assessment as part of that learning process and take the feedback and use that to improve. So then I'm just going to wrap up really shortly. When I was part of the What Works change program, I led a project where there were 7 discipline teams across 4 campuses. The ethos was students as partners. So the students and staff worked together, not just to give us feedback, but to tell us where were the problems, why were the first years dropping out. And the students were co-creating the solutions. And we did that over 3 years, and it was a really successful project. But I wanted to research what was the impact of the partnership working on the staff and students. So I engaged in one-to-one interviews with staff, one-to-one interviews with students across the 7 discipline areas. And I got them to describe their lived experience of working in partnership. And there were 2 key themes that came out of that, out of the data. One was around personal development, and the other was about enhancement of the learning climate. And what really surprised me most about the data was there was a high level of consensus in what the staff were telling me and what the students were telling me. And that's something I didn't expect, but it was just amazing when I read back the transcripts. So what it came back down to was both staff and students had engaged in personal development. Both were moving on to new mindsets. You know, they were both thinking differently, and they were learning new skills. So, for example, staff were saying, I thought all my students, I was treating them as a homogenous group. You know, I've really got to know them. I now realize they all have different aspirations. They all have different skills. And I am now ready to let go the control of the classroom and let them take the direction of where they think we need to go. So I've learned, you know, to kind of share the learning spaces and the learning process within that. And I thought what was really useful coming back from the students as well was that notion of the learning climate. Students were saying, you know, because I've been engaged, and I was thinking back to what Catherine and Peter were saying earlier when they were disseminating their experiences of the partnerships. They were saying, it's really, the students were saying, I've really learned what it's like to be an academic. I thought the academics just came and lectured. I didn't realize they'd all this other work to do. And then the staff were saying, I now know what it's like to be a student of today. I know that they've got part-time jobs. Some are working 20 hours a week. Some have caring responsibilities for children or for parents and so on. But the students were saying, it's made me more motivated to be ready to come to class. I'm reading, I'm engaging, I'm coming. And then some of the other students were saying, even though I'm not a student partner, the engagement, because the engagement has gone up for the engaged partners, it was having a ripple effect in the classroom. And because more and more students were asking questions and participating, the other students were getting engaged because of it. So there was that kind of ripple effect going around. So it really was encouraging that active learning process. And then when I disseminated that kind of research, I went back to Ella Cahu's model, and I was thinking, well, if you look at the last 2 columns now of the immediate outcomes of student engagement, students as partners can actually really help with that, because what do we want? We want the students to come away with the knowledge, skills, and the attitudes. We want them to be satisfied, to have pride, to have good well-being. And the long-term outcomes is that we want them to be successful. We want them to be successful in their work life. We want them to engage in lifelong learning. And we want them to have that personal growth and citizenship. And I think that if you go back to that students as partners piece, I think that can really help the engagement, and that really helps those shorter and longer terms outcomes. I'm not suggesting students as partners is a panacea for everything to do with student engagement, but I certainly think it's really helpful in terms of building relationships, and relationships are the basis for the learning process. So I'll just finish and point you to some references there for anything that I've referenced earlier so that you can follow up. So I will pause there. I'm happy to take questions at this point, Michaela, or whether you want to go on to the next speaker and then have questions at the end. But thank you very much for listening, everyone.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. So someone has said that they completely agree student attendance does not equate with engagement. And also I really love the knowing, doing and being, because I think we're so focused on learning the theory, we forget about the practical application. But definitely afterwards we'll go to questions. But now I'm so excited to welcome Rhiannon Cavanagh, who is a student associate and coordinator of the National Student Associate Assembly, NStEP, and the National Forum for Teaching and Learning. So Rhiannon is a recent graduate from Waterford Institute of Technology. She went on to serve 2 terms as Vice President for Education with the Students' Union. participating in many institute boards and committees, as well as some enhancement initiatives and TU merger conversations with IT Carlow. Rhiannon then went on to spend 6 months working as a student intern with the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, working predominantly in the area of student success and with the National Forum Student Assembly. She is now completing the final 6 months of her internship, working in partnership with the National Student Engagement Programme, continuing to coordinate the Student Assembly and very enjoyable meetings, as well as supporting the NStEP team on some of their ongoing projects and initiatives. So really excited to welcome you, Rhiannon.
Thank you so much, Michaela. I'm just going to share my screen and make sure that everybody can see my slides. Are they okay there?
Yes, it's brilliant.
Perfect. Brilliant. So thank you so much to NStEP for asking me to speak today. Getting to work with the team for the last couple of months, I was absolutely delighted when they asked if I would consider kind of coming along, and given my experience in kind of, I suppose, working in the area of student partnership and student representation, and kind of just giving some maybe examples of ways that we can kind of work together as a sector to kind of enhance these both locally and nationally in Irish higher education. I think a big thing that's going to strike throughout this presentation, and it's a lot of the themes that we've already heard a lot today, is that we're kind of going back to basics with this. We don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel, or it's kind of an if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of a situation, in terms of there are a lot of good examples out there and a lot of examples of good practice out there. So I think sometimes when we speak to institutions and we say, these are ways in which you can kind of enhance, student partnership within your institution, people can get a little bit frightened because maybe it's something that either they're doing kind of indirectly and not noticing that they're doing, or maybe they think that they have to come up with all these different new ideas and new concepts that have never been done before, when in fact there's a lot of good examples which we'll kind of see throughout this presentation, that are really, really easy ways to kind of incorporate this throughout higher education, and hopefully it'll kind of give people some inspiration to maybe take back to your own institutions and look at kind of incorporating nationally. And I think it's really good then that this is happening on the day of the strategy, because I think the new strategy, given that it focuses both on staff and students, it kind of supports that culture, that institutional culture element that has been mentioned. I know Lee mentioned it earlier, and then Roisín emphasised it again in her presentation this afternoon. It kind of is that element of institutional culture, and what we can kind of do, I suppose, to enhance that, and to kind of, I suppose, move away from maybe some older practices and move into kind of more structured institutional practices that support the elements of student partnership and student engagement. But it definitely is a two-way street, and does incorporate both staff and students, kind of given that their role. So just, I suppose, a little bit of background. I, as Michaela said, I am a WIT graduate. I spent 2 terms serving as a student representative in WHE Students' Union. So I suppose that gave me some experience in working with an institution from a student representative perspective. And then I went on to complete 6 months with the National Forum. So it was nice to kind of flip the lid a little bit and get to work with the sector from a staff perspective, and incorporate or engage mostly with staff as opposed to students, because it is nice to see both of those elements incorporated. And then I'm continuing the second 6 months of my internship with the National Student Engagement Programme. So I previously worked predominantly in the area of student success, and we launched our Student Success Toolkit back last October. So getting to kind of, I suppose, engage with staff in that process gave me a lot of food for thought in terms of institutional culture and institutional practices at the moment, and what we can kind of do, or ways in which we can kind of enhance small practices but make a huge difference with those. We currently coordinate the National Student Assembly, which is a group of 47 students made up from 32 different higher education institutions across the country. And that can be from universities, from ITs, from TUs, from smaller institutions, the lot. So there's a really eclectic mix there. And those students are brought together kind of bi-weekly to discuss different areas of teaching and learning and student partnership. And what that does is that kind of, I suppose, brings the concepts of student partnership from a local level to a national level, and it is that best practice sharing, which is what brings me on to the case study call. I know Ashley mentioned it earlier on, but I am going to plug it again, and that we are kind of NStEP are developing a resource hub at the moment, and are looking for case studies of you know, ongoing projects or best practice examples in terms of student partnership or student engagement in your institutions. So you can find more information about that on the website, and I would definitely urge you to go and take a look. But I suppose before you can kind of talk about different examples of what, you know, you can do to increase student engagement in your institution, I suppose we should go back to the basics and the question of what is student partnership. So this is taken directly from the NStEP Steps to Partnership framework. So I suppose it incorporates three different areas that do link together, which you'll see later on. But I suppose student voice is the active students sharing their individual and collective lived experiences within the learning community, expressed through views and perspectives demonstrated by formal and informal conversations, debates, feedback, and so on. And just, I suppose, that overall feeling of being heard. And I think that's a big thing for students. I think students are much more inclined to be engaged, and they're much more inclined to kind of work with you as an institution when they feel as though their kind of feedback and what they are putting forward is actually being listened to. And even if something is not feasible, just to know that an institution has been able to kind of look into it and say, okay, look, we've taken on board your point. We can't do exactly, you know, what was suggested, but here are some other options of what we can do and what is feasible. So that leads on then to student engagement, which is a process by which students and staff seek to work together to shape decision making in higher education. So that is very much a collaborative process, and it very much is staff and students working together, which I think is brilliant in that the strategy is incorporating kind of staff workshops. As I know, a lot of kind of focus in the past has been on students, so it is brilliant to bring in the staff element, because that is something that kind of, I suppose, shone through quite strongly when we were doing our kind of strategy consultation forums with the sector. And then both of those things combined then kind of, I suppose, bring us on to what student partnership is, defined as in the framework, and that is the practice that both drives forward and emerges from meaningful student engagement, and it recognises those power dynamics in higher education. And we're talking about that element of culture again, that culture change, because that is, I suppose, the kind of end goal of what we're trying to reach. So I suppose taking those kind of three definitions and then bringing them into a really, really defined short definition, you know, when students are given a platform to kind of express themselves and their experiences, and as I said, that feeling that you're being heard, that incorporates the student voice, which brings us on to enabling that voice. And when students feel like their voice is enabled, they are kind of, I suppose, more open or more willing to engage with staffs and with their institutions. Because I think sometimes what we can see is institutions will say that there is a lack of engagement among students, but then when you kind of, I suppose, dig a little bit deeper into it and look at, you know, what has been done, you know, it can sometimes be a little bit tokenistic or a little bit kind of just tick box exercises, and that doesn't give students the feeling that they are being heard. But when they are enabled to kind of speak up and they know that their feedback is being taken on board, that does kind of, I suppose, incorporate that student engagement element. And then when you foster the culture where students feel like they are engaged and that engagement is more meaningful, and that kind of builds those strong staff student partnership relationships, and they're formed from that element on, and then they can kind of, I suppose, grow and move on from there, and it becomes, I suppose, a whole institutional approach as opposed to just kind of, I suppose, an isolated approach. So, you know, those are the three core concepts that allow us to embed student partnership in higher education. So once you have those three things, which I'm sure every institution does, and maybe they just need to kind of look in a little bit deeper and recognize where exactly, you know, those concepts are embedded, and then I suppose how they can make that a more widespread approach so that it is whole of institutional. That allows us to kind of move forward then and treat students as partners in higher education. So now that we've kind of looked at, I suppose, the definitions and what kind of student engagement, student voice, student partnership actually is, we can kind of look at different ways in which we can kind of enhance and support this locally on an institutional level. So one of the main, I suppose, remits of student partnership is that communication element. It is recommended that higher education institutions should define roles and responsibilities of student representatives, because I think sometimes what can happen is, you know, when an institution has a class rep system in place, it can kind of just be taken on board that we have class reps, that's student partnership, and you know, we're doing our bit there. But in fact, it can sometimes be quite inconsistent departmentally or faculty wise, in terms of, you know, some student reps in some departments can be really, really engaged, and then some can be less so. So that kind of, I suppose, is an inconsistent approach. And to have it kind of institutional wide, it would be brilliant if those kind of roles and responsibilities can be defined within kind of policy and strategy, to make sure that they are enshrined, I suppose, in the ethos of each institution and how they choose to approach kind of student engagement as a whole. Another thing that we can kind of look at is those open and regular communication channels. Sometimes, you know, institutions can use widespread communication, or like communication through VLEs, whether it's Moodle, Blackboard, whatever that might be. And again, that can be considered as we're engaging with our students, we're communicating openly. But I suppose that's very much a one-sided communication in terms of, you know, students will receive communications to them, but often there's not the channels for them to feedback on communication, or to maybe ask further questions, or to follow up. So kind of having those channels that do allow for those things, so do allow for that follow up and that kind of feedback loop, things like that, and that will in turn kind of, I suppose, engage students more, because they feel like they're worth something to their institution, and the opinions that they have, or the thoughts that they might be able to bring to the board, they feel that they might be heard more. So it is, I suppose, empowering that student voice. And then often it came from the NStEP academic representation report, which was a summary report for the National Forum NStEP project, that often wherein students feel that they are more engaged. So where they're engaged maybe in formal committees, and whether that's faculty boards or course boards, or whether it's, you know, through academic councils or governing bodies and things like that, where they feel that they are included and where they feel that they are being heard, they feel more supported, and they are more inclined to engage. So that, I suppose, is a direct correlation between the ideas that we should be enshrining them more in policy and strategy and things throughout the institution, and that is a direct then response to students actually feeling that way, as that came from an opinion report there done by NStEP last year. So I suppose moving on from communication, then we look at the concept of feedback. So we can kind of look at feedback in two different ways. In one sense, it can be obviously academic feedback, which is based on, you know, your exams, assessments, and so on. But we can also look at experiential feedback, which of course comes from students, you know, kind of being able to feedback on their learning experiences, their student experience as a whole, their experience with kind of dealing with the institution as a whole. And I suppose it's really important for students to feel like the feedback loop is closed. Something that kind of came out strongly when we did our strategy consultations when speaking to students is that often students feel like they can be talking to a wall in one sense, whereby, you know, they kind of, I suppose, put their feedback to the institution or to the course boards or the lecturers or whoever it is. And then what happens is they feel like either they're not around to see if the feedback has been enshrined in the policy and procedure, or what can happen is they feel like they're giving their feedback, but it's kind of going nowhere and they're seeing no change. So they kind of think, okay, well, what's the point in me being engaged? What's the point in me giving this feedback if it's not going to be taken on board? Now that is a two-way street. I suppose sometimes, you know, students can ask for a lot, but they don't necessarily bring solutions to the table. And I think sometimes where there is a culture of respectful and open dialogue between students, and students feel that their voice is heard, it does lead to a more solution-based approach, in terms that feedback that students can give is often more constructive when they know that they're being heard and they're being respected and considered, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to fill out this form and I'm going to give my feedback, but this is not really going to go anywhere. Students are less likely to fill out those forms. Students are less likely to kind of, I suppose, contribute that feedback, whereas when they do feel like they are being heard, or when their voice is kind of, I suppose, respected within their institution, they are more likely to engage in those kind of feedback channels. Then if we look at kind of staff-student collaboration, again, a really, I suppose, key term in this is that it is meaningful. So often institutions will pop students on a committee, and then they will tick that box and they will say, yeah, we're engaging with our students. But that can sometimes be a little bit tokenistic, because often students can be very outnumbered on committees, or often maybe students are brought onto committees that maybe aren't, you know, they aren't as overly familiar with, so they don't feel as though they have a lot to contribute, and then they leave the meeting feeling like, oh, I didn't really do my part there, or I didn't really kind of know what to say there, or I didn't feel like it was my time to speak up in that situation. So when students are involved in things like discussion forums, focus groups, and kind of direct student feedback, whether it's from kind of a wider student cohort or from reps on the ground, that kind of, I suppose, encourages students to collaborate more with staff, and kind of, I suppose, opens that two-way street of, you know, student partnership and student collaboration. And then we look at the term co-creation. So this can be very much kind of, I suppose, based around the academic side, and it's something that our National Student Assembly has actually been looking at in terms of assessment recently. And when we have seen direct examples of when we have things like negotiated learning agreements, choice-based assessment options, opportunities for students to, I suppose, feed into the curriculum design and assessment design, then, you know, they feel as though they're more included, and they are more inclined to be engaged. So I suppose involving students in those planning stages can, I suppose, increase that engagement, but it can also avoid some of the issues that we've heard today, such as things like maybe assessment bunching or deadline bunching, or that feeling of students being overwhelmed. When they kind of, I suppose, have their say in that, students can kind of, I suppose, map the way with their academic staff in terms of what can be achieved within a semester. We had lots of learning from the pandemic, and that's something that came through from students, is that over the 2 years of online learning, students were really involved, and they felt like they were being heard, and they felt like they were, I suppose, involved in things like assessment and curriculum design. But when it went back to maybe kind of more of the traditional style of on-campus learning, a little bit of that was lost. So it would be fantastic if some of that could be carried on beyond, within reason, of course, you know, depending on what's feasible for what institution. It would be fantastic to see some of that kind of ethos of co-creation that was, I suppose, indirectly adopted in a sense, because, you know, it was very much last minute, and it was very much everybody was kind of scrambling to you know, move online and to kind of figure out how things were going to work. So it was very much kind of, I suppose, a collaborative effort, but unfortunately it does seem to have been lost in some cases. So kind of bringing that back and making sure that that co-creation element is really strong is quite important going forward, in terms of kind of, I suppose, developing and building on student partnership within institutions. So now that you've kind of looked at a national or a local approach, I'm going to give you some examples of things that could be done nationally to enhance student partnership. So things like, I suppose, engaging with projects like NStEP. Now that there is that staff and student element, I suppose, hopefully, given in the next couple of years, we will see a lot more engagement with the NStEP program as a whole, because obviously it is so beneficial. For institutions, you know, supporting students that are working on kind of national initiatives, such as maybe the Student Assembly, you know, EDTL interns, national projects, and so on. That can be really important, I suppose, in encouraging students and kind of building on that staff-student partnership, informing national policy and strategy. So getting involved maybe in strategy consultations that come up across the board, or kind of, you know, feeding into national policy where possible. And that can be really important for engaging students and staff as a whole. And then keeping up to date with work ongoing. So things like maybe, you know, resource building, or you know, hubs and things like that, contributing to those wherever possible. Is really important in terms of developing that national support. And then I suppose, finally, I'll just leave you with a quote that I suppose I've been using for a couple of years now, and it is that alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. So I suppose when it's, you know, working in isolation, and when people are siloed and things like that, you know, if it's just students working on their own, or if it's just staff working on their own, sometimes it is hard to kind of achieve whatever we want to achieve in terms of those engagements, or that student voice, or that empowerment. But I suppose when staff and students come together, it does achieve so much. And so I hope I haven't gone too over time or anything there, but I would welcome any questions through the chat. So thank you very much.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Rhiannon. Yeah, it's brilliant to hear, and it's all about, you know, a shared responsibility and communicating to students. And I just through both of your presentations, there was just these common themes of just you know, empathy and showing students and staff what it's like to be in each other's position. So we actually do have a question, and this is for Roisín. And is there a danger in a focus on the individual student, that the collective and political identity of students can be ignored?
I don't think so. I think we have to recognize that, you know, the students are coming to us, they are individual, they are unique, they have those characteristics. It's about setting the scene and creating that learning climate where everybody feels able to engage. And it's only after that, then you'll be able to get, you know, the student feedback, the student representation, the student involvement in projects. But if everybody's not feeling able to engage, then you won't get that representation that you need. So I think we do need to remember about those three dimensions of student engagement and how do we engage students individually, and then we lead on to the collective. It's just getting the starting point right and creating the right conditions for it.
Great, thank you. And to Rhiannon, great presentation. How do we find the balance between inclusive representation but avoid the tick box or tokenistic challenge at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose just initially one thing that springs to mind is, you know, often in institutions, a lot of student representation can come from maybe students' unions or student representatives that are elected in institutions. And that might be only teams of maybe 2 to 3 students acting on behalf of maybe 10 or 12,000 students, or 20, 30 or 40, 50,000, depending on the institution size. So I suppose more widespread engagement in terms of, you know, those student forums or student focus groups that maybe aren't with the typically elected members of the student representation cycles, or engaging with maybe wider groups of reps and things like that, you know, where it's more students on the ground, that is often a way to kind of, I suppose, let it be less tokenistic in terms of it's not the same people every single time, you're kind of hitting different groups, and I suppose that will hopefully kind of move forward in terms of being less, be more meaningful, I suppose, in terms of how students are engaged on the ground.
Brilliant, thank you. And if you have any more questions, please put them in. And it's just great to hear your examples of really authentic student partnership. It would be great to hear in the chat if anyone else has any. But just from my side, I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about, you know, what worked well and how you found your research. But just from your own experience, what are the challenges to establishing and maintaining student partnership? That question is to both of you.
I'm happy to go first. I think there are definitely challenges, and I think we need to be cognizant of those and almost expect those, and then we can deal with them. It does require a mind shift, definitely a mindset shift. And I think there needs to be time for partnership as well. And I think it's very helpful, and I think someone said it earlier, is to theme some of the work around partnerships. You won't change everything overnight. So identify where the priorities are. So for example, when I embarked on partnership, it was around the first year experience, and we had a dedicated project for that, and we were able to build the capacity. And I saw before my very eyes how people's mindsets were changing. When we started that project, staff were blaming students, students were blaming staff. By the end of that project, there was just a complete turnaround because of the conversations and working together. These things take time and you can't rush them. And another thing I would say is start small. You know, start with something small and celebrate the wins. You know, we heard today from staff and students talking about how successful that needs to be celebrated in those institutions. If we're truly going to strengthen the value of student engagement, then these stories, and that's what they should be, stories, not hard facts, of student engagement and student partnership need to rise to the top, and they should be celebrated. And then that encourages other people to get engaged. And I think someone said earlier about case studies as well of effective practice. It's really good to have some sort of a mechanism where those case studies can be shared and people can learn from each other, because that's what sparks ideas and inspirations.
Perfect. Yeah. I might just jump in there. I suppose one of the kind of main challenges in terms of speaking to students that I have noticed is that often students will ask for a lot, and it's not that staff don't want to maybe incorporate some of what's being asked, but sometimes they don't know how, or sometimes the kind of training is not provided, or the mechanisms as to how to do so are not provided. So I think, you know, from having that whole of institutional approach, where, you know, staff are respected, students are respected, you know, senior management have bought into this, you know, making sure that everybody is kind of on the one page with student partnership and student engagement. You know, it can provide more training opportunities for staff, it can provide more upskilling opportunities, so that when students ask for something, it's not, if it is something that is feasible to do, it's not that it can't be done, it's just a way of looking at how to do it, I suppose. So that would be one of the challenges I have encountered in terms of student engagement, but it's maybe a small bit of how to maybe combat that as well.
That's brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I completely agree, and sometimes it's kind of, the question is how can we support staff to support students, really, and how can you just let students know, you know, this isn't possible for these reasons. So we have another question here. One could argue that students' unions used to be more overtly political and challenging to HEIs. Now they might be becoming part of the administrative structure. So what do you think of this and the implications?
I can make a start. I think they can have a dual role. I think they can still be challenging to institutions, and I think that's a really important role that they play. But I know from my experience in working with our student union over the last 10 years, the more they have come into the learning and teaching space, the more value they've got out of that. So it's been mutually beneficial, you know, for both of us in terms of how our reps are trained, in terms of building capacity for students to, you know, to be more engaged and to have more of a say and to really engage in that co-creation space, because it is difficult. Co-creation is not easy. It is problematic, and it has to be nurtured and it has to be valued. And the capacity for staff and students to co-create has to be developed and absolutely supported.
And Rhiannon, you have a 2-year term as a student union officer. How did you feel it was communicating with staff members?
Yeah, no, I kind of wholeheartedly agree with a lot of what Roisín has just said there. It can be very mutually beneficial because I suppose my 2 years were predominantly kind of COVID years, I suppose. So, you know, in those years, communication was really, really good, because it had to be. There was no way to navigate through the 2 years. You know, the institution were receiving questions from students, we were receiving questions from students, and you know, everybody kind of wanted to know everything, but in reality none of us really had the answers. So there had to be that mutual kind of working relationship between ourselves and the student union and the institution to be able to, I suppose, to look after students the best as possible and to, I suppose, make the best decisions for them, which we try to do in all cases possible. But that didn't mean that in situations where, you know, we felt that maybe the students' union weren't listened to, or we weren't even considered in decision making. That's not to say that we didn't get maybe a little bit political about it and a little bit kind of, I suppose, riled up about it, and that's I suppose where your kind of autonomy will come into it, in terms of the fact that yes, you do work with the institution, but given that in WT Students' Union we were completely autonomous, it gave us that opportunity to be able to maybe raise when we weren't exactly, you know, happy with something, and to kind of give alternative solutions as to what we think maybe was the best thing at the time. But I suppose the institution did respect that in a lot of situations, and when we did have to get a little bit kind of maybe political about it, we were listened to and we were considered then in decision making. But yeah, I do think overall, in a sense, student unions can be very beneficial to that working relationship with the institution.
Thank you so much for sharing. So we also have another comment, just that recognizing individualism or smaller groups of students empowers students, and it doesn't preclude coalition. And just massive thanks and praise to you both for your brilliant presentations. Inclusive representation is very important, referring to students' voices and not just the same same groups of just one student voice. And yes, just a massive thank you to you both for your time and sharing your expertise. If anyone does have any more questions, I'm sure you can put it in the chat for another minute, or speak to the presenters offline.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you both.